start. And good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our next webinar in our Thomas Westcott series. My name is Patrick Tigwell. I'm a general practice partner with the firm at their Exeter and Tiverton offices. And again, it's my pleasure to be your host for this afternoon's webinar. It's been a quieter week this week, I think. It's a sort of national pausing for breath, isn't it, before the Bacchanalian orgy that is July the 4th on Saturday. And much has been in the press about that. And actually, when I Googled Bacchus, I realised he was the Roman god of agriculture, which is fitting because obviously that's the subject of today's webinar. Now, there have been a couple of other things happening. We've had the instigation of version 2 of the coronavirus job retention scheme. This is flexible furlough and all of this. And that, I think it's fair to say, been accompanied by much wailing and gnashing of teeth from payroll departments up and down the country as they struggle with the concept of usual hours. But as well as that, we've had, we had, that was the subject of last week's webinar. And my colleagues, Chris Hill and Mark Tibbett, did some very good slides on working out calculations on that. If you'd like them, please email us or put a request in the chat or the Q&A and we'll send you those slides. Additionally, a couple of things to remember. You can still defer your July payment on account if you're self-employed and you had to make this payment on account otherwise at the end of July. That can be deferred till January. So that's one thing to bear in mind. And also, if you have deferred your VAT payment, bear in mind that finished on the 30th of June. And if you cancelled your VAT direct debit, please reinstate it. As I said, this week we're concentrating on agriculture and specifically risk management in the sector. It's a sector that Thomas Westcott takes incredibly sort of seriously. As you can see by the sort of freebies and things that we've given away in the past. We've got the sort of the TW cow, the TW wellies. They do say, it might say WT from where you're looking, but it does say TW, honestly. And obviously, the pièce de résistance is the Massey Ferguson tractor. Now, I know what you're thinking. It's not a Massey Ferguson. I had you there. It's a John Deere. Anyway, you'll be glad to know that I'm not the one doing the talks this afternoon. For that, we've got two experts in their field, and you can see them there. First up will be Nick Smye. Now, Nick is my partner colleague in our Honiton and Axminster offices. He has a large sort of agricultural portfolio, so acts for a lot of agri clients. He's also a member of our Thomas Westcott Management Board. So, you know, stand by your beds for that one. And after Nick, we have Pete Brown. Pete heads up our agricultural consultancy department. And what they do is assist Thomas Westcott clients with detailed business plans, for example, for conventional and diversified agricultural businesses, while at the same time working closely with, us, his accountancy colleagues. In the sort of run up to the planning for this webinar, Pete was saying after months of lockdown, he's really quite talkative now. So we'll have to watch out for that one. So, so looking forward to hearing Pete. I'd also just finally like to mention Jamie Giles, who's our head of marketing, and he is controlling the webinar, recording it, and we'll send that out afterwards. I do normally make a football-related joke at his expense, but given that Chelsea lost last night and Arsenal won, I think we'll just move on. See how many farming-related puns I can get in this afternoon. So what's the plan? Well, we'll have about 3/4 of an hour webinar. As I say, in a minute, we'll hear from Nick, pass on to Pete. We have had some questions come in, but if you haven't yet submitted a question, you still can on the Q&A button, as I say, down there. Or if we get to the end of the webinar and you still haven't asked your question, but you'd like to, you still can, again, at events@thomaswestcott, all one word, .co.uk. Please post anon at the start of your question if you'd like to remain anonymous. And do remember that we can't really answer very detailed questions about your individual affairs. But if it is a question like that, we'll get to it after the broadcast by probably the partner that deals with your affairs on a regular basis if you're a client. So enough from me. As I say, it is time to move on, and we'll go to Nick for his piece on risk and everything like that. So Nick, over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Patrick, and welcome everybody to this webinar. I'm just glad to stop all of those puns, Patrick. It was getting a little bit painful there. So on to some serious stuff. I mean, clearly I am going to look at the impact of the pandemic and how it's affected farming industry and to a certain extent what comes after it and how that may affect the farming industry as well. I have some slides, so hopefully I can share those with you. If everyone can nod if they can see them, that would be good. The ones I can see, brilliant. I think it's fair to say that the farming industry has probably been less seriously affected by the pandemic than other sectors of the economy. I found this sort of chart produced by AHDB, which sort of looks at the impact on the dairy industry across the country. And you can see in England, the majority of farmers have said that the impact of COVID on their farming business has been non-existent, no impact, or low impact. I mean, just summarising that slide, I mean, 80% of dairy farmers, as I say, have said no impact or low impact. Where they have been impacted, it's in the sort of cases where they've had a reduction in prices received, either for milk, livestock prices they've received at market, but just less people being at market bidding for the livestock. Some dairy farmers have been asked to reduce the volume of milk that they produce, and in some cases they've had deferral of payments, and some milk collections have been cancelled. So some farms have been impacted, so it's only right that we look at what support might be available for those farms with respect to the government support schemes that are in place. Most farms operate as partnerships or sole traders, so the most obvious sort of scheme of support available to them is the self-employment support scheme. The initial phase was brought in for businesses that were adversely affected by the pandemic to pay 80% of profits for 3 months. The time to claim under that part of the scheme runs out on the 13th of July. So if there are any farmers or other businesses that think they qualify for that part of the scheme, the time for claiming it is running out. That said, the scheme has now been extended. There is a second phase of the scheme. So if you feel that your business is still being adversely affected by the pandemic after the 14th of July, then you can make a claim for another 3 months worth of profits at a 70% rate of grant. It's quite interesting, the government didn't actually define what adversely affected by the pandemic actually means. They basically left it for the businesses to decide for themselves whether they have been impacted in a way that sort of supports a claim under this scheme. And from our farming clients, it's been a fairly mixed bag as to who's claimed, who hasn't. Some farmers feel they've had no adverse impact, as we've seen from the chart, and have made no claim under the scheme. Other farmers feel they might have been a slight impact, but not sufficient for them to feel comfortable claiming under the scheme. And then we've had other farms who clearly have been impacted, reduced milk prices, prices at market, reduced volumes that they've been allowed to sell. And those farmers have claimed under the scheme. And I would imagine some of those will continue to claim under the second phase of the scheme as well. And it can actually be worth quite a lot of money to a partnership. You could have individual partners making claims under this scheme for loss of profit. The second support scheme is the business support grant. This is available to businesses who qualify for small business rates relief. Most farms qualify for rates exemption, don't pay business rates, so would not be able to claim under that scheme. That said, there are some farms where they have furnished holiday letting or holiday letting units on their farms, and in respect of those properties, they may be entitled to a grant. Local authorities should have made those payments to qualifying businesses automatically, but if there are any farmers out there who have these sort of properties and haven't received that grant, it may be worth following that up. As Patrick mentioned, the job retention scheme, the furlough scheme continues. pretty rarely used by farmers, as you would expect. This is where you have employees who don't have sufficient work to do and you furlough them. You can claim some government money to cover the cost of keeping those workers on your payroll. Very rarely used by our farming clients. One last support scheme specifically for dairy farmers, a dairy response fund. Again, very rarely is that applicable to our farming clients here. It's in respect of dairy farmers where they've received a very dramatic reduction in the milk price they were receiving in April. There's got to be a 25% reduction in the milk price they're receiving comparing April with February. And for most of our farming clients, that just hasn't happened. I think it's for particular cases elsewhere in the country. So I won't spend too much time talking about that fund because it's a very specific support for a very specific set of problems. So all of those schemes actually put money into your business. And you just need to be aware that each of these grants is taxable income. So if at the end of the year, you've received some of this grant support and you are still making a profit, some of this grant will actually go back to the government in the form of tax on those grants. A couple of other sort of reliefs available. As Patrick mentioned, you are able to defer automatically your self-assessment payments on account due in July and push those back to January. And if you have PAYE liabilities, you may be able to make an arrangement to spread those payments over a period of time with HMRC. Of course, those are just pushing off the inevitable. You are going to have to pay those amounts, so you're not actually saving anything. And I think the feeling should be that if you can afford to pay those on time, pay them on time, don't save a problem for yourself down the line. The last thing I'll mention with respect to support schemes is the bounce back loans, government sort of underwritten loans, up to 25% of your turnover, up to a maximum of £50,000. No arrangement fees, interest free for 12 months, and then sort of repayable over a 6-year term. I think Pete's going to talk about this later, but it is just a loan. It needs to be repaid. And so unless you've got a good reason for taking out the money, I think you need to think very carefully before drawing down one of those loans. I sort of mentioned, I think what concerns me probably more than the current situation we're in, because that hasn't impacted a lot of farmers significantly, is what comes next. I think it's clear that the government's going to have to raise significantly more tax at some point in the future to pay for the pandemic and the costs of the support for businesses, for individuals, and for all the hit that's happened for the economy. So where can they raise that tax? Well, obviously they've got rates of income tax and corporation tax, but they've also got reliefs that they could look at. And farmers are sort of quite important users of some of these reliefs. Most farmers own valuable assets in the form of land, property, and the nature of farming is you would be looking to pass those assets on to the next generation. So you fall bang smack in the middle of inheritance tax situation. And so it's important that you understand what reliefs are available in respect of inheritance tax and what those reliefs are worth to you. There are two major reliefs for inheritance tax that are available to farmers: agricultural property relief and business property relief. Farmers hold agricultural land and property, so qualify for agricultural property relief. And for most farmers, they use those assets in a farming business, so they can also qualify for business property relief. As I mentioned, land and property, very valuable assets, so inheritance tax is a very important issue. Currently, those reliefs are very generous. Agricultural property relief can relieve up to 100% of the value of agricultural property, and business property relief can relieve up to 100% of the full market value of all business assets. And as I mentioned, farmers, they hold agricultural property, and if they're using it in their farming business, they will qualify for both of those reliefs. So they have two chances to get 100% of relief against the value of their business and their farming assets. So what could those reliefs actually be worth in practice? So if we just take a fairly standard farmhouse worth 500,000, 200 acres, 2 million, other farm assets, livestock, equipment and the like, £500,000 there. So the total value of the farm asset, £3 million. Without any release and just using up your nil rate band, which is available to every individual, the inheritance tax bill on that farm would be over £1 million. With the release, the inheritance tax bill on that estate is nil. So in that situation, those reliefs for that farm are worth over £1 million. So you can see why the government might be interested and whether there should be some clawing back of the value of those reliefs. So how might they look to change the reliefs that are available? Currently, agricultural property relief is available to all land that is used for farming. It doesn't actually have to be farmed by the owner. A landowner can actually rent out their land for somebody else to farm and still qualify for 100% agricultural property relief on the land. There is some thought that the relief may actually be restricted to landowners who only actively farm the land themselves. Now that could be a real issue where you've had an active farmer for most of his life, but in later years is starting to wind back his active involvement on his farm, maybe renting out some of the land for other people to farm. If this relief gets restricted in this way, that can have a major impact on the relief available to a farmer in that situation. As I've already mentioned, the current rates of relief for agricultural property relief, business property relief are 100%. The government could just look to reduce the rate at which that relief applies. And there's no reason why it has to stay at 100%. Back in the 80s, the relief ran at 50% for APR and for business property relief. It was just taken as part of your budgeting process that if you inherited a farm, you would have an inheritance tax liability that came with it. The rules allow you to spread that liability over 10 years, and you just built that into your calculations and budgeting. As part of inheriting a farm, you would have to pay an inheritance tax bill over 10 years. So there is no reason why that 100% stays at 100%, and it could be something that is looked at by the government in the future. Currently, business property relief, it can actually give you relief on businesses which have mixed activities within them. So you could have a business that's got a bit of trading and maybe a bit of investment activity. Classic would be a diversified farm. You've got farming activity on one side. They may have some rental units in the farm. They may have some fields rented out for solar panels somewhere else. So they've got a whole mixture of activity going on in what they would call their business. The farm is trade, rental, and renting out the land is investment. And at the moment, so long as the trading activity represents more than 50% of the overall activity, you will get business property relief on all of those assets in that business. There is talk that that 50% test should be raised to 80%. So 80% of the overall business will have to be trading. And so there could be a number of diversified farms where if that change were made, it can have a significant impact on the availability of relief on the non-trading assets or on the business as a whole, in fact. So what can farmers do? Because if these changes may be coming, we need to look at what we can do to try to protect the current reliefs. The main thing you can do is look at giving away land and business assets now and trying to bank those current generous reliefs. There's absolutely no guarantee that it will work, but it gives you a better chance of doing nothing because the government could still reduce the reliefs and effectively backdate those changes to gifts made in a few years previously. But if you do give away assets now and survive 7 years, the value of those assets falls out of the inheritance net altogether. You don't need to rely on any reliefs if you survive 7 years. So if you start to give away assets now, you start the 7-year clock running, you give yourself a better chance of just falling out of inheritance tax altogether. And you've given yourself another good chance that any gifts made now will be taxed under the current reliefs, the 100% reliefs available to all farmland and business assets. Another reason why you might want to look at giving away land now is there is another relief called holdover relief currently available to farm property, which will avoid a capital gains tax liability arising on a transfer of land between family members as well. So you can actually, under the current rules, give away land to your children, no capital gains tax, and get the clock running for inheritance tax. There are sort of knock-on benefits potentially of giving away assets now. Those assets will be protected from care home fees if they became relevant in the future. And it could also increase the availability of inheritance tax allowances against the other assets in your estate. Currently, everybody gets a nil rate band of £325,000 for inheritance tax, and there's a second allowance available of £175,000 per person, which you can use against your own home. but that second allowance is removed if the value of your estate goes above £2 million. So giving away some assets now could bring the value of your estate down below the 2 million and give you extra reliefs available against the assets that you keep. Of course, there are some downsides that we need to consider as part of making gifts during your lifetime. I always sort of say to my clients, the beauty of giving it away on death is you don't get to see what happens to those assets after you've given it away. Giving it away during your lifetime means you get to see what the recipients get on and do with it. We need to bear those in mind. So the first consideration on making gifts during your lifetime is you will lose out on the uplift in value free of capital gains tax, which you currently get on death. That said, there is talk that that tax-free uplift in value on death is up for sort of consideration that should be removed, particularly where you claim other reliefs on passing things on death. So maybe that benefit of holding on to assets until you die is going to be removed anyway. Outside of the tax issues, there are, of course, just the practical issues of giving away assets that you currently own, potentially to your children. You will lose control of that asset. You don't own it anymore. And so you may be sort of removing the tax risk, but you may be bringing in other practical risks. If you give away assets to your children, what happens if they divorce? Say 40% inheritance tax and lose 50% of the land in a divorce. What happens if your children die before you? What did their wills do with the land and the assets that you've actually passed to them? What happens if your children lose capacity? Or they might just decide to use the asset in a way that the parents just disagree with them and wish they wouldn't use them in that way. So there are practical considerations that need to be taken into account, as well as the tax considerations. If you did feel that giving away assets to your children was just a step too far at this stage because of the sort of relationships your children are in or the situation you find yourself in, but you still want to try to remove some of these assets from your estate, there is the option of passing those assets into a trust. That gives you a little bit more control as a trustee to sort of keep control of those assets without sort of releasing complete control to your children while still removing those assets out of your estate. Of course, this is just a sort of touching on these points. There's a huge amount of things to be thought about, considered before any assets are given away. And you absolutely would need to take full sort of advice from us before any decisions are made. But it's just highlighting, as I said, I think now is the time, given the reviews that have been carried out in respect of these reliefs, the fact that the government are going to be chasing tax in the future, I think we really need to be taking seriously looking at making gifts of business assets and farm assets now. That's all I have to say, Patrick. So I'll pass back to you.
All right. Yeah. Thanks then, Nick. Just a couple of things then. Question in, how are profits calculated for the income support grant? So I guess that's, with trading businesses, it was, I think, essentially what was on the tax return, wasn't it, for 2019? But does it, with with people who are self-employed in the agri industry, with farmers averaging, how does that sort of impact it?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of issues, really. I mean, the first thing is, I think particularly, taxpayers, they may look at their accounts and see a profit figure on there and assume that's the profit figure that's going to be used for calculating the self-employment support scheme. I would mention another thing as well. There are qualifying conditions for your profit levels before you can even qualify for that. Your profits need to be below £50,000 and your profits from trade need to represent at least 50% of your total income. And the danger is you can look at your accounts profits and say they're below 50,000, I qualify for this support scheme, but what we're actually looking at are your taxable profits. And within any business, your accounts profits have adjustments made to them to turn them into your taxable profits. So accounts profits may bear little resemblance to your taxable profits, which are what we need to look at to see whether you qualify for that scheme. I've had some farmers say my profits are below 50,000 and they are on the accounts, but we've had to make adjustments for depreciation. Herd movements are reflected in the accounts, but they're treated differently for tax purposes. So we have to add back movements on the herd valuations, and the actual taxable profits are above 50,000 and they don't qualify for the relief. Where it can catch right as well as the other side, A lot of farmers, of course, where we can, we try to reduce taxable profits as much as possible, possibly claiming capital allowances. And there is the risk that if you've got older farmers who are drawing pensions or have rental income, we've actually reduced their farming profits for very good tax reasons to as low as possible, and it represents less than 50% of their total income, which is great in normal times when it reduces income tax bills, but works against you if you're trying to claim the self-employment scheme because you don't hit the 50% test of income from trade being 50% of your total income. So it's just important to realise it's not a cash profit, it's taxable profit, which can be a very different number. And just to complete that as well, it is before any farmer's averaging, because of course, even on your tax return, you can start doing 5-year averaging of farming profits. This test is before any averaging adjustments.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, isn't it? That clients wouldn't necessarily understand the distinction between accounts and taxable profit, or accounts profit and taxable profit. So I think the advice there is, you know, any sort of queries you have on these sort of things, do contact your accountant. Especially if it's us, please contact us and then we can advise further. I think we'll move on to Pete now, because he's been sitting very patiently there. He's now unmuted himself, so he's fired up and ready to go. Pete, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Patrick. Thank you, Nick. Hello. So today we're going to try and look at some of the issues and risks that face farmers on a practical point of view, and some of what Nick has talked about is a significant risk, taxation and the ability to maintain a business going forward. So farming in South England, how's it been? It's not really been a very normal year in many ways, because forecasts for profitability and so on have changed through the year, because we've had variable weather, to say the least. Autumn was a very difficult autumn, so a lot of autumn crops weren't sown on time. We then had a pretty wet winter, followed by a cold spring. And it went dry, and for some it was lovely weather, but it was dry for quite a period. And that also impacted on crops getting established and so on, and in fact for grass growth, and second cuts in particular of forages, and that will impact on people's businesses into the next year. And then on top of all that, we've had the COVID situation and lots of worries about what that was going to do for farming incomes and so on, because of course, you know, when you think about eating out and you think about food and drink outside the home, that's often where the best margin is made for people. And if all that has ceased, has that impact on the production of foodstuffs that farming is completely involved with? Well, it has to a degree, but much less in some ways than had been expected. So forecasts have changed. We have been relatively less affected. And I think that's partly because we have a very stable business down here. So the model down here is family farms. It's tend to be smaller farms. The average farm size down here is 168 acres, which is quite a bit than the average UK size. And of course, that does take an impact on huge variance within that. But these farms are much less risk averse, and therefore they don't, well, they're much more risk averse, and they don't take the risk that some of the bigger businesses would take elsewhere. But when we look at the farm structure down here, 75% of all farmland is in grassland of one sort or another in the southwest. And that crop is a crop that doesn't get established every year, and is a crop that therefore can survive, albeit at lower yields, in difficult weather conditions. And 75% of farmland is grassland. Therefore, what does that mean with regard to the production of produce down here? Well, 39% of all English dairy production it comes from the southwest. So we have 39% of the total English production of dairy products in our area. The good thing about that is it's a very attractive area, therefore, for dairies to invest and to spend money on processing milk into dairy produce, and I think that helps in the long run, because it seems to me that our dairies that we supply down here over the years, much more, there have been a number of difficulties, but on the whole, they're much more stable than they can be elsewhere in the country. We also have 27% of the English beef production here in the southwest. So we're very much involved in grazing animals and producing from grassland. And that means also that per acre, probably on average, the farmers down here have more capital tied up, so they may well have a strong balance sheet because they've actually produced these animals and this working capital over the years. So we also have down here opportunities for contracts with people like Blade to grow beef on contract for selling into the trade, and that's also, I think, gives a good, consistent performance to those enterprises. We also have 66,100 people working on farm in the southwest. Now, many farmers will say, I don't believe it, I can't get any staff. That's an awful lot of staff working one way or another in the southwest. And one of the big worries at the time that COVID started was the concern about foreign workers, because we do use a lot of foreign workers, particularly down into Cornwall in the veg growing areas and also on dairy farms. But so far, that seems to have worked okay. There are question marks over that source of labour with regard to Brexit and so on. But the labour force has been relatively stable. You know, there's not many areas of business where people haven't discussed furlough people on a fairly regular basis. But certainly in agriculture, there's been very, very few people that have gone on furlough, because in fact, they're all very much involved in production at the ground level. So we have a relatively stable and a relatively good business model here in the southwest. That's not to say that it's not subject to risk. And if we look at the UK, this is the UK figures from DEFRA. These were produced in February. I just always like these figures. It's quite interesting to look at on where DEFRA thinks incomes are going to go on farming into the next 12 months. And there's some ups and there's some downs, but the ups are predominantly grazing animals, which, of course, I've already said here in the southwest is quite a strong area of business for our farming farmers in general. So the grazing animals, the government felt we're going to have a strong year. Much of that was down to cost of cereals. Globally, there's quite a lot of production been going on, more production than normal, and cereal prices have been predicted to be lower, which would impact on feed prices for the livestock sector. For here, that would be of advantage to our farmers, because I think we only grow something like 10% of the England area of crops down here in the southwest, of cereals. So we looked to be as though we were going to have a relatively good year. And dairy farming was going to be static. But there's not many people that would have said that dairying in general last year had a bad year. Overall, dairy incomes seem to have held up relatively well over the last couple of years. So a relatively good state of mind. And then we come to COVID. So what do we need to think about? What are the risks? And in fact, when you know what the risks are, how do you control those risks? What creates the risk? And how do we take action to mitigate the risks on farm? There's some fairly obvious risks that we can mitigate fairly easily, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But in general terms, there are risks that come from all areas of business and life in general. So well, what we're looking at, we've got political risk, climatic risk, market risk, business structure risk, and skills and people risks. And if you were to put those in order of importance, I don't think you could actually put them in any specific order. The political risks are there, and the political risks are very much revolving around Brexit at the moment, and what policy would be going forward with regard to agricultural support, because of course we've got the PPS and so on ending in 7 years' time, and we've got coming out of the EU, the policy will have to be UK grown policy, and we won't be using EU policy long term. Politically, are tariffs going to stay? What tariffs are they going to be? Does that mean we're going to have cheap food coming into the market? So there's an awful lot of things to consider from that point of view. And climatic risk. There's been a lot of problems. Climate change is obviously causing a problem or issues. Some would say climate change for down here where we get such a lot of rain that it's probably not a bad thing, but actually we're going to have more extreme weather. And does that affect what people can do with their farms? So, a market, what is the market for our food? Are people going to become more fussy about what they eat and what they buy? Probably. How does that impact on how we reduce risk for individual farm businesses? Structure. What do I mean by that? Well, business structure is a risk because if it's an individual running a business, that person has himself to worry about. If it's a business structure with more than one person involved in the business, there may well be different pulls on the business that can impact the business and create risk. And then, of course, on top of that is, when I talk about structure, is how capitally strong is the business. And then skill and people. And skill and people is a significant risk, and it's one that we don't talk about very often. And actually, probably, we all ought to talk about more often when we're sitting in front of farmers and trying to help farmers understand where their business is going into the future. So, yeah, what are the government going to do after this pandemic? It seems to me they've already stated that they're going to spend on infrastructure. They're going to complete leaving the EU. Remember, a quarter of our export foods goes to the EU, which is £22.5 billion a year. Want to ensure adequate and safe food supply. And actually, a big thing they're having with regard to the environment and to farming is that they want public money spent wisely. Most of those things are going to take money in order to complete. And therefore, as Nick said earlier, the government is going to be looking at its sources of income in order to try and bring in some balance to what they're doing. Highly likely to mean that farming is going to be for a higher level of tax on activities that go on. There's a taxation risk, and as Nick said earlier, you can mitigate that risk a little by, well, you certainly can mitigate it by having a plan about how you dispose of your assets and indeed spread your assets between your family into the long term. Leaving the EU, well, there's our export market there to think about, but on top of that, there's the tariff situation, which it hasn't been decided yet, but it's seeming that they're going to leave tariffs as much as they were, but there will be exceptions to those rules, as always with this government, and we have to wait and see what that means. But food safety, I suspect, will come up higher up the agenda following our current pandemic, because people are more concerned about where their food is coming from, and the government will need to ensure that there doesn't have very high risk coming into this country into the long term. And adequate food supply. Well, that's an interesting one, because, you know, we all saw the shortage of flour early in the pandemic. Was that the food producers, or was that simply the market that was changing that? Well, the government are going to want to try and make sure that we've got an adequate and safe food supply. And I think at the producer level, it is unlikely that we're going to not be able to produce enough food with imports and exports to satisfy the needs of the public. But it's the safe food area there that I think is most important. So if we look at that, we go on then to the market. Into the market. Well, people have changed. People aren't eating out so much. Supermarket buying has changed. Perhaps there has been more internet shopping. Apparently these groceries was only accounting for 7% of the grocery food but prior to the pandemic, and is now at 10.2%, so it's moved. Will it continue to be the case, or will people want to go back to their local shop to go on buying? Local buying. From a farmer's point of view, it would be lovely to think that every individual consumer wanted to buy locally and buy his food particularly. How do you achieve that? Farm boxes, perhaps, farm shops. But what happened to farm shops? A lot of those had some difficulties when the pandemic started. You know, when you're meeting with the public, you are more likely to have issues potentially going forward about being able to go to market all the time. So that's something that can certainly help farmers, but is it the right one? Food miles, tracking, source of production, and so on. People, I've had two in the last 3 weeks, I've had two farmers come to me to talk about milk vending machines, which is interesting, but they don't always work, and they really do need to be well thought out before they are put in place. You're encouraging the public to come to your or close to your farm on a daily basis to pick up milk. A lot more traffic will risk of potential infections and so on, and accidents and all the other things that can happen. And you know, you've got to be very good at the food hygiene regulations to be able to sell direct to the consumer product. Those things are certainly worth thinking about. And then diversifying. How many advisors like myself have gone around the country over the years suggesting to people that they might like to diversify away from a pure commodity production in agriculture? Because commodity production inevitably means that you are a price taker rather than a price maker, and in diversifying in some way or other, perhaps you can get a bit more margin out of your business. And that has worked very well for many people. Diversification came to a full stop pretty much for some businesses when the pandemic started, because how many farmers have a campsite or a letting property and so on? And if you get that wrong, you can be hit with a significant negative cash flow at a time. But diversification itself generally can spread the risk for farming businesses and bring them closer to the public and cut out the middleman. So there is an argument that says that the market is quite a good area to have a look at for doing a diversification. Business structure. So who owns the business? Is the business land owned separately to the trading business? Is it owned by active farming people, or is it owned by family members that are a bit different from the day-to-day stresses of running the farm? The risk with that is that if the land and ownership is different to the business, the person who has control of the land does not necessarily always have control of the business, and vice versa. And it's important to try and sort those things out early on, particularly early on when people have families and growing families to think about and so on, is how is the security, how secure is an individual in a business if he is one of a number of potential inheritors from a family that have become a bit distant from the farm. So land ownership and how that's owned is important. You know, if the land is owned separately from the business, can that land be used as security for enabling that business to develop and borrow money to move forward? And that can be an issue for businesses. And succession. I personally think it's really important for families to understand the succession lines from a relatively early stage. I don't mean when people are 5 or 6, but I mean when people have actually started to show an interest. And it might be that there's a family of 4 sons, and it's the 3rd son perhaps that has a real interest in farming and comes from school and works on the farm day and night for all his time. But how then does dad split the assets in a fair way? And I think it's important that families do discuss that and talk about it. We often talk about this at breakfast meetings and so on, but it's really important. And we're working one or two people trying to sort out these sort of issues that have been developing over a long period of time. And they're not sorting. So it's really important to sort that. And then, of course, it's the big family assets. And Nick talked a bit about the tax implications of big family assets and how to transfer them. And it is a really, really important thing. We regularly see on sets of accounts partners with very, very little capital who are running the business and may even be in a negative capital account. But these things need to be thought about, how and when those things get transferred. Age and collaboration and share farming. Some people, those are all nasty words. Age, well, it catches with all of us, I'm afraid. And I think that what we need to think about there is, how do we bring skills in? It's not just about age, it's about skills. If the next generation are going to have skills that are much more attuned to the current world and ideas, bring them in early enough so that they can express those interests, rather than trying to wait till mother or father retires and then try late in life to bring that energy to something that they're doing. And I really do believe collaboration is a really strong thing, because with collaboration, you get skills that you don't have that bring into the business. And if you think about what skills a farmer needs to have, a farmer needs to be a good livestock manager, a good crop grower, a good mechanic, a good property manager, a good financial whiz, and a good people person. Now, I'm pretty sure that many people, all people, would struggle to have all those skills in one person. So bringing in somebody else to help you in a collaborative venture to develop a business on is a really good idea. And then share farming. What about share farming? Share farming has come and gone over the years, and it can be a really good way of actually encouraging young people into farming. But it must provide them with a big enough share of the income to enable them to make a living and enable people to move on from that position onto the next rung of the farming ladder. And there are share farming agreements that work, not as many around as you would hope, but share farming is something that ought to be looked at as people come perhaps towards the end of their farming career. And the risk of them being unable or physically to manage the farm means that a share farming agreement might be a sensible way to go. So the business structure is really important, and trying to understand how that impacts on all the different parts of the business is really important. Then skills. Well, what is the operator skill base? It's quite important, I think, for people to identify strengths and weaknesses quite quickly within their business. And, you know, I go to farms and, you know, I get told how good the cows are performing at. Well, the cows are performing very well, but you've got less money in the bank at the end of the month than you had at the beginning of the month. So something's not going right. And it's there that people need to understand what the area of weaknesses in that business, to try and bring that round, to try and make sure that the business is successful over the whole and not just one part of that business. And employee skill base. There are a lot of highly skilled people in agriculture. There are also a lot of people that are treated in agriculture but as workers with little skill or interest. That's rather sad, because everyone, if they are encouraged, can actually show interest in one part of what they're doing. And having people with interest in what they're doing will always make sure that the business goes forward. And some of the best businesses don't always look at the lowest paid to try and get the work done. They try and match the person to the job. And that's really important with a highly skilled and quite a technical job in farming. So it's really important to try and identify that. And with regard to skills, the other thing that people need to think about is what is their personality. You know, there are plenty of people, really nice people, decent people, who actually don't particularly like dealing with people. Well, not much point in making them have an ice cream shop then, because, do you want an ice cream? Isn't really going to help very much. And then there are people that are really good at the people side and talking to people and so on. But they may not be very good at the detail and at making sure that all the things are in line and so on. And it's trying to important that, you know, we identify for all people where they are and what they do in the business, so that their personality traits can be used to the best advantage going forward into the next period of time. There's a lot of different things there that actually impact on what's going to happen with a business going forward. What could we do about it? Well, I mean, good decisions are made on good information. And I think for many businesses, analysing the current position with regard to what risks there are to that business and what might impact on what they're doing is a really important thing to do. I mean, I've got farmers down in Cornwall that I deal with who are growing all sorts of crops, and some of them are growing crops that are quite unique to them, and some of them are crops which I, frankly, haven't really heard about. Now, that's fine, but the market there, you need to have a look at the risks. It's great growing a crop that will grow well if you've got a market for it. So the current position with regard to all those risks is important. What's the risk of a maize crop not growing to full maturity because you get too wet autumn? That can happen in some areas. I think brainstorm the changes with advisors and produce a plan with detailed market and financial figures to try and understand if we do these things, to make these differences, to make this business work better, where is the financial figure? What's the bottom line going to be? How's that going to change? But I do think that all this sort of risk management analysis and financial analysis really does need third-party contributions, because they always bring a different stance to the table. And absolutely importantly, before going down the route of spending any money on a diversification or a major change to the business, check the tax implications. Once you've got the plan together, then obtain the funding. And funding is available. The banks are all trying hard to get new business, and farming should be a business that people want to lend to, because certainly, as far as I'm concerned, down here in the Southwest, it's a great business to be involved in. It's a good, strong business. And what I want to do, and what Thomas Westcott wants to do, is we want to help farmers move forward, and we can do that with you. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you, Pete. That was a party political broadcast.
Excellent.
No, that's really good and obviously very detailed. So yeah, do get in contact if you have any queries. A couple of questions. I know we're sort of overrunning a bit, but one that's been asked, again, I'll address this to you, Pete, is the chap saying, this is Philip saying, well, you've got sort of maybe the top 25% of farmers, whatever, in the early adopting sort of category, and they're kind of diversifying and ensuring resilience in their business. But how do you then motivate? The question is, how do you motivate the other 75% to sort of get going as well and keep up?
Okay, yeah. I mean, that is difficult because there's always going to be a range in performance levels of any group of. So I personally believe everyone talks about benchmarking, benchmark this and benchmark that. And benchmarking is a really useful tool, because what you have to do is, for an individual business, they all won't be in the top 25% because they're all poor at the same things. You really do need to analyze and identify the areas of weakness for an individual business to try and understand it. And I try and split a business into 3 areas. Some of you will have heard this before, but basically I think there's the technical farming, there's the management handling of the farm, and then there's the structural stability of the business. And if you look at those 3 very crudely and find out which part is at the weakest area, that's the one to tackle first of all, and try and get to change in order to move that forward. And for some, it may well be that their capital structure is completely wrong and they need to sell an asset in the end. But it's better to discuss that and agree that process without letting it just drift further and further into the chasm that it may be falling into.
Okay, thanks, Pete. And Nick, I'd just like to kind of come to you for the sort of Brexit question, really. It's not really, it's just, you know, with your agricultural clients, are they worried about, you know, with the whole COVID thing going on, are they worried about sort of the Brexit situation? And obviously the fact that we haven't got a lot of information to give them perhaps at the moment. I mean, are you hearing that from your clients?
I think it's a mixture, really. I mean, you're absolutely right. There's very little, excuse me, information. And of course, I think that information on Brexit has become even more quiet because there's something else sort of trumping it in the news headlines. I think we know a certain amount, which is that, you know, the government have sort of said they are going to sort of continue with our own equivalent sort of subsidy system, basic payment sort of support system. So I think we know there's a little bit of continuity there to start with. But I think longer term, I think we're into sort of what Pete's talking about, which is trying to assess the risk that when those schemes start to be altered, changed, how do you build that into your farm planning if they're going to be worth less? Because if you look at farm profitability, you know, the current sort of basic payment, support payments represent quite a big sort of proportion of a farm's profits. And on some farms, you know, you take it away, they might not be viable anymore when it comes to supporting the family that's trying to live off of the farm. So I think possibly Pete's got more to say than I have because he sort of touched on it in his speech, but I mean, I think the issue is, we're still waiting to see, and it's not helpful, the silence, and that is one of the consequences of COVID, is that it's just not making the headlines. I mean, we understand it's still going on in the background and agreements are being made, but we're not hearing much about it.
No, okay. I think that's possibly a subject of a future webinar then when we know more. I think the final question then to Pete really is that you mentioned diversification earlier.
Yeah.
The farmer sitting there, you want to improve your profit. You know, you want to be more profitable, increase the resilience of your business. Is now, as we sit here now, is that a good time to consider an act on diversification?
It's a very good question. I mean, the truth is, it may well be for some people, but every time you start a diversification, you need to really consider how much capital that's going to take to start off with. Because if it's going to take a lot of capital and that will require funding, you may not be able to get it, but even if you can get it, there's a significant risk that if your sales aren't what you expect them to be, for instance, then your income flow is lower. And what impact will that have on you? So there are diversification. Actually, one of the partners going out and earning money doing something else is a diversification to a sort. Well, there's no risk in that because that person can come and do that. So diversification covers a huge range of things. I would say the capitally expensive diversifications right at this point in time need to be thought about very carefully, particularly where you need additional bank funding, because actually, if that puts the rest of the business under risk, you should wait until it's a bit more certain. But it does look like the future for rural diversified business long term should be good, because I think most people believe there's going to be less international travel, and those businesses that I know and talk about, their bookings for the summer seem to be going through the roof at the moment, for instance.
Yeah, so the future looks
good, but just be careful with capital.
Okay, yeah, so I think that's a great note to finish on. Thanks, Pete. I'd like to wrap things up at that point. Apologies, yeah, we have gone a quarter of an hour over rather. As I said earlier, if you have any further questions you'd like to ask, don't be sheepish. It's my final kind of poor pun of the day. It's the events@thomaswestcott.co.uk sort of email address, and we will get to every question. If you're a client of TW please put the partner that deals with you, and obviously we'll ask him or her to contact you back. We'll let you know also when our next webinar is, so stay tuned for that. And finally, I'd just like to thank Nick and Pete for giving up their time and doing their presentations. That's been great. I'd like to thank you, our attendees, for attending. It wouldn't be the same without you, obviously. So have a great rest of the week. Mind how you go on Saturday, and embracing my inner Ron Burgundy. Stay safe, Devon and Somerset. Cheers for now, guys.